later. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Tony Alvarez, and I'm the Vice President of the Arab American Bar Association of Illinois. And AABAR is proud to present the CLE on the future of affirmative action for minority businesses, as well as a case study of MENA Americans as part of its pioneering biannual diversity and inclusion series. So for those of you that are new to AABAR, welcome. We are a bar organization, association with close to 300 members. We have a very active committees, including our esteemed CLE committee, as well as our judicial evaluation committee. So we encourage you to take a look at our website, which is AABAR.org, to see both our prior CLEs, including our presentation on diversity and inclusion in legal education, and our presentation on fighting discrimination. On our website, you can also find a list of any upcoming events we have, as well as those past events. And our most exciting event of the year is coming up. It's AABAR's installation dinner, which is coming up on November 2nd at the Allegra Royal Hotel. Tickets are $125, and you can buy them online at AABAR.org. Plus, we have sponsorship opportunities if you'd like to be a sponsor. As a side note, this CLE is being recorded for educational purposes, so make sure to please keep yourself muted. And in order to receive the Illinois Professional Responsibility credit for the CLE, please email us your name and ARDC number, and I'll put this in the chat as well, but you're going to email it to info@arabbar.org. And again, I will put that in the chat box as we're moving through the presentation. Without further delay, it is my honor to introduce the moderator for this afternoon, AABAR's co-founder, past president, and co-chair of our CLE committee, as well as the judge that I clerked for 2 summers, my mentor and friend, Judge Honorable Bill Haddad.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks to you and Noura, Yannicki, and Jawad Shalabi for putting this together. It's truly an exciting event today. And welcome everybody to Chicago Arab American Bar Association's biannual continuing legal education series on diversity and inclusion. This is our 4th installment. The last 3 involved diversity and inclusion in higher education, minority rights and voting rights, and law firm hiring practices. Today, we're discussing the future of affirmative action for minority business programs, enterprise programs, with a case study on MENA Americans. And if MENA means Middle Eastern North African, it's a new acronym for our community. And Louise, Cainkar, our professor from Marquette, will talk more about that. Now, again, if you want CLE credit, go to our chat room and get that information from there. And if you have any questions, put it on the chat room. And if we can answer those questions, we will. And if you want any written materials, again, look on the chat room and you can link into it. Now let me introduce our all-star panel today. We have with us attorney Colette Holt. She is a nationally acclaimed expert on minority business issues relating to inclusion, diversity, and affirmative action. She has crafted governmental disparity studies for minority business enterprise programs nationally, as well as here in Chicago. She will discuss the current legal status of the women minority business enterprise programs in light of the dramatic changes expected in affirmative action matters currently before the United States Supreme Court. We have with us the Honorable Marcelino Garcia. He is the only elected official here today. He is commissioner with the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Cook County in Chicago. He chairs the commission's finance committee, which oversees their $1.3 billion budget. He is partly responsible for overseeing the participation of minority businesses in government programs. He'll review the Metropolitan Water Reclamation's district's work to include LGBTQ, disabilities, and MENA minorities in an economic study to qualify them for inclusion in its minority business enterprise program. Ashley Alvarez is with us. She is the committee director and legislative counsel for the City of Chicago Committee on Economic, Capital, and Technology Development. She oversees and prepares legislation and regulations for consideration by the Chicago City Council and its committees. She was instrumental in preparing a resolution unanimously adopted by the Chicago City Council, which directed the very first governmental economic study to qualify MENA Arab Americans for minority business enterprise programs. It's the first of its kind in the United States. We have with us Professor Louise Cainkar. She is a professor of sociology, social welfare, and justice at Marquette University, my alma mater. She is a foremost expert in demographics of the MENA American community in the United States, particularly here in Chicago. She'll talk about her historical work tracing demographical data and resources relating to the MENA community. Now, let me lay some groundwork for what we're going to do today about this program. Let me begin by saying there are many governmental programs, many governmental bodies like Chicago and Cook County and Metropolitan Water Reclamation District that have established a public policy to achieve an equitable and competitive business environment which will support economically disadvantaged minorities. Governments have established women minority business enterprise programs for many decades, maybe 5, which often require up to 25% of governmental contracts to include these disadvantaged minorities. The federal constitutional guidelines which govern the implementation of such race and gender conscious programs require that the governmental agency conduct what's called a disparity study in order to find the qualitative and quantitative evidence that race and gender do significantly impede a full and fair opportunity for minorities to compete. These disparity studies typically include most minorities, such as women, African Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic Americans. Of interest to the MENA Arab American community and our Bar Association is the fact that no governmental body anywhere in the United States has ever conducted a disparity study of Arab Americans to qualify our community for certification for these minority business enterprise programs. However, this national exclusion of Arab Americans from these studies ended here in Chicago last March when Alderman Gilbert Villegas got the City Council of Chicago to unanimously adopt a resolution directing the city to conduct the first economic study of MENA Americans in the United States. 3 of our speakers today had a hand in formulating that resolution. So we'll begin with the esteemed Colette Holt, our foremost expert in disparity studies. She helped devise that resolution, gave us a little guidance on it, and she'll be updating us on certain cases to be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in the next term concerning affirmative action programs. So without further ado, Colette Holt.
Well, thank you, everyone, and hopefully you can all hear me. I'm actually sitting in the airport right now in a corner, and so I apologize for the noise or whatever, but hopefully you can hear me. I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to my client, Commissioner Garcia at the Water Reclamation District. We completed their disparity study earlier this year, made that presentation, and I know that they are moving forward with revisions to their ordinance because, Commissioner, I need to start working on those this week. But I'll be brief. I do have slides that you can look at your leisure that go through recent cases as well as the pending challenges before the Supreme Court to the higher ed affirmative action programs for undergraduate admissions for Harvard University and University of North Carolina. And I particularly wanted to highlight those because I think it's sad to say that the court may take this opportunity to radically revise the legal standards for any type of race-conscious government decision-making. Now, certainly these are cases that don't involve contracting in any way. It really is just higher ed, but it's important to know that the standards that the court has developed for, at least so far, evaluating race-conscious admissions programs are vastly lower than the standards for government contracting programs. So there is certainly a fear amongst many of us, and I certainly think that that's the betting, that the court is going to tighten those standards. The worst case scenario would be that if they decided that overall race-conscious government decision-making period is unconstitutional. So there's a gradation of possibilities. But I think the signals certainly are that they're expecting to do something major. If only because, and one of the reasons I really enjoy talking to other lawyers is because you'll get this. The court skipped the step of waiting for a Fourth Circuit opinion in the challenge to North Carolina's program and took review straight out of the trial court. Now, in fact, UNC had won at the trial court after a bench trial, as well as Harvard had also won, but there was at least a First Circuit opinion also upholding Harvard's program for their litigation, but the court just skipped that altogether for UNC and took the two cases in tandem under the extraordinary public policy idea. So I think certainly we know that Justice Thomas and Justice Alito have been on record for decades as believing that race-based government decision-making in any form is unconstitutional, reverse discrimination against white men. When both Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were lawyers at the Department of Justice earlier in their careers, they both wrote memos arguing that the United States Department of Transportation's disadvantaged business enterprise program for federally assisted contracts is also unconstitutional. And the DBE program, those regulations are at 49 CFR Part 26, have withstood every single legal challenge, including here in Illinois, not once but twice in front of the Seventh Circuit. And so we know where they're coming from. Well, that's 4 votes. Justice Roberts, one should not forget, did give us the inimitable tautology of the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. That's out of the Seattle public school case. So it is definitely a situation for deep concern. The cases will be argued October 31st. We certainly will expect a decision by the end of the term. And so please do keep your eye out for that. When we get a decision, I don't know if perhaps your CLA committee may want to organize something about that. But you can certainly always, you can follow me on Twitter at MWBE Law. And I do post articles there. So, please do keep in touch. So I think that certainly raises the question about what governments can do now to be proactive. The situation is grim, perhaps. We also lost all of the challenges to the Black Farmer program out of the COVID Relief Act. There's a pending challenge to the DBE program for US DOT contracts. We lost the COVID cases. So it's not looking too good. But I do think that there are things that governments can do that will help and at least begin to prepare us for what might be a world in which agencies will no longer be able to set race-conscious contract goals. And certainly some of the most important are for agencies to look at their own behaviors. Many of the things that are barriers to minority, small, disadvantaged firms are agency imposed. So for example, does the agency pay reasonably on time? I'm happy to report that the Water Reclamation District pays on time. And that was what people told us in all of the disparity studies. Unfortunately, I cannot say the same for the city study we completed last year for the city of Chicago and the recent study we completed for Cook County. So payment is critical. I mean, you'll just crush small firms if you don't pay on time. Other things are things like experience requirements. Do you really need to have designed 10 fire stations to do the next one? Probably not. What about equivalent experience in the private sector or with other agencies? Another thing that we often hear about are insurance requirements. Do you really need $3 million of commercial general liability insurance to do a $150,000 project? Probably not. Not a whole lot you can do about surety bonding. There is the Illinois Public Bond Construction Act, but there are other areas where agencies really need to look at themselves and ask, who's in the club and how do we open that up? Mentor-protege programs are another approach. Small business set-asides, which you can do under Illinois law. You cannot do them in many states, like Texas, for example, but you can do them. So the agencies are not helpless. to assist minority and women-owned firms should we end up in a post-affirmative action world. The other thing, of course, for minority firms to do for themselves is to familiarize yourself with all the ways that the agencies are different, because they all are different. The way the city of Chicago does business is not the same as the county or water rec or the state of Illinois or the TOE or the Chicago Public Schools, or you name it. So that's absolutely something, especially if you are counseling small firms, if you do corporate and business work, to be able to help them with that. And then lastly is this whole certification issue, and Judge may talk about that. I want to make sure I don't go over my time here because we've got other speakers, but we are working, as Judge Haddad pointed out, and thank you to Alderman Villegas for this, to work on an economic study for the city that would help to expedite certification for firms that are owned by individuals that are not currently part of the presumptively disadvantaged groups within these various ordinances. So with that, I'll stop. And I don't know, Judge Bill, if you have questions or any more time, but I want to make sure that I can keep y'all moving.
I have a quick question. I know you have to go. If the expedited process is put into place for water reclamation or the city of Chicago, how much work is going to be eliminated for the individual seeking individual certification for minority status?
I actually think quite a lot of work. One of the things that's been very difficult about these individual approaches, and so for example, that's been in the disadvantaged business enterprise regulations for US DOT since 1999, and only across the country, a handful of firms have been able to use it, is because it requires an individual applicant to marshal so much sociological and business and census data all on their own. And that's just beyond, I think, the time, the capacity of most business owners who are small. I mean, if you're like us, we're small, and you do a lot of things. And so the idea here would be to present the evidence that is not directed towards any individual firm, but that talks about barriers to MENA Americans' ability to get contracts, and really would consist of looking at some census databases. It's not a lot out there about businesses. It's thinner, but there is some information. And then gathering qualitative or anecdotal data from interviews, small focus groups, and an electronic survey, which if we're going to do this project, we really, really need all of you to help. Please do participate if we can get the city to do this, and I think we're on a good path to that. But that would make it much easier for everybody.
Just a real quick follow-up to the Supreme Court consideration of the Harvard case and other cases. What's Plan B, Attorney Holt, if in fact the Supreme Court eliminates or substantially modifies affirmative action in the United States? What happens to our minority business enterprise programs? Can we keep them alive in some other way?
Well, I think it will depend on what the court says. You know, if it's a flat out prohibition, that will be much more difficult. Certainly, we're hoping that maybe it's just a modification. And then I think agencies will just need to look at where they are, what kind of data they have. Are there going to be ways to comply? Don't throw in the towel just because something happened in higher ed, but be proactive about what's coming. I'll leave you with this last bit of information, which is that there are several groups out there that are legal think tank types that seems to now have these programs in their sites, including what strikes me as probably the most dangerous one, which is a group called America First Legal. America First might sound familiar. This group was co-founded by Stephen Miller, lately of the Trump administration. Remember him with the children in the cages? That guy. And they had tons of money. So I think we will need to get our act together quickly. Coalesce. Groups like the Arab American Bar Association can take a leadership role in working with agencies. So hopefully that's how we'll be able to address things.
Well, thank you so much for such an informative presentation.
Thanks,
And have a
everybody.
safe trip today.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Thank you
Okay.
so much for having me.
Thank you. We have next the Honorable Marcelino Garcia, who actually is the only elected official with us today. And he is spearheading the Water Reclamation District's work to include LGBTQ, disabilities, and MENA Americans, other minorities, in an economic study to qualify them or us for inclusion in its minority business enterprise program. And without further ado, the Honorable Marcelino Garcia.
Thank you, Judge Haddad, and thank you, MENA, the AABAR Association, and everyone for joining this important topic. Ms. Holt jumped off, but we wouldn't be here without her and her team. Truly, Colette Holt is an eminence in this arena, and people really listened to her, and she was able to work with us on ensuring that we do a good ordinance or a good policy for the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. I'm Marcelino Garcia. I was elected 4 years ago to the Metropolitan Reclamation District Board. I am a double minority in many ways. I'm both Latino and also a member of the LGBT community. Tony, if you can, I think we have some slides to kind of tell the story of where we started and where we ended up. And as you will see, this is part of a story in many ways, which we've done for the LGBT community in terms of procurement, but which could be followed for MENA, both at MWRD and other entities. Next slide. So the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District's mission is to protect the health and safety of the public, protect the water quality as a supply source. You know, most of the Lake Michigan and everything else that's around is very important. We're fortunate to be in a region where we have resources. And the last part of it is to protect businesses and homes from flood damages. And call coming in. Next slide. Here you can see the map showing the scope of our service area, which is about 883 100 square miles. And we have $1 billion plus budget. Probably about half of our budget has to do with capital construction and other items. So that basically means that all those items that we either build or procure could potentially be part of the different participation ordinances that we have. Next slide. All our work is done in the procurement area is done through 2 departments. Recently, we did a strategic planning, which was passed unanimously by the board last year. Procurement and materials management is a department that procures all construction goods and services required by the district in accordance to the Illinois statute, which is the Purchasing Act. In the strategic plan, one of our sections, the 4th goal, is related to community engagement. And we want both to expand our field of companies that deal with the district. And that's done in conjunction both from procurement management, next slide, and our and our diversity department, which is in charge of doing the ordinance. In terms of procurement, we award about $131 million in terms of construction. Our plants and also what's called the deep tunnel, which is a huge engineering feat, is part of that. We also do a lot of stormwater programs and projects across Cook County to ensure that communities are safe from the floods. We procure about 33 million in terms of materials and equipment, and about 55 in terms of services, which with about 17 million in terms of engineering and professional services. So some of those areas do qualify for participation goals. In terms of what people at times call furnish and delivery, which might be purchasing things directly. Currently, we don't apply goals to those areas, but we're in the process, hopefully, of applying goals to anything that we procure, doesn't matter what, if there are enough companies to service the needs of or qualify in that area. Those words have been spoken by Colette Holt in our disparity study sessions. And I think one of the big things is there needs to be a number of companies that could potentially satisfy the program. So that's why it's very important to ensure that MENA American companies get registered either in different sections. And we'll talk about a little bit about how we will do that at MWRD in case that we move forward with MENA Americans in the future, which we do have support of several commissioners for it. Next slide. So this slide, the MWRD's diversity program, we deal mostly with MBEs, WBEs, small businesses, and veterans. Veterans is the latest designation that we got into our program, which was passed, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. But we are focusing in other areas, as we will talk about, mostly LGBT and people with disabilities, and you'll see how we arrived there. Next slide. So in terms of MWRD's Affirmative Action Program, which goes back many years, and it was done through Colette Holt's assistance through a disparity study session. I think we've had 2 so far. She just conducted the study at the same time that the city of Chicago and Cook County did theirs. She presented to our board, and hopefully we will approve it again with changes suggested by the Board of Commissioners to make it better, most likely later this year. Appendix A deals with most consultant contracts in minority women and small businesses requirements. Appendix C is our affirmative action requirements. The ordinance itself is Appendix B. That's what we usually refer to. And Appendix V is the veteran-owned businesses policies. So in most of our contracts, we usually look at Appendix D. And at times, if there's enough vendors, we may apply Appendix V to it. So that's our current policy. And we do have the threshold of we apply goals to any contract of over $100,000. So anything smaller currently doesn't get goals applied. And it's mostly either in the service or construction contracts as part of our policy. Next slide. So I told you about the appendixes that are currently as part of the board. So when I got to the board, I was one of 2 members of the LGBT community who were on the board. The other one was Commissioner Deborah Shore, who's currently the director of the EPA Region 5. Deborah and I we're in sync in many areas, and having 2 of 9 board members, we wanted to make sure that we would be able to hopefully expand our policies. So as we were looking at what could potentially be done without having a disparity study behind. Her staff and my staff with us, we drafted what we kind of called Appendix O. O meant other. So we wanted to kind of push a little bit in areas that hadn't been explored and see what could potentially be done. So with Appendix O, we kind of modeled it after the other appendices. And we called the district to apply goals to the other, and other meant LGBTQ plus, but also peoples with disabilities. Peoples with disabilities is another area that could potentially get goals applied if there are other companies. We presented our ordinance Appendix O at a disparity study session a few years back. Ms. Holt looked at it and she's like, wow, this is innovative in many ways. But as with everything that we encounter, we needed to be cognizant that that the district just couldn't approve an ordinance with the bulk behind it of data. Otherwise, it could potentially be challenging court. So next slide. So that's how we ended up with 2 policies on both LGBT and peoples with disabilities. Those 2 policies were approved by the board unanimously last year. And the policies both encourage the district as part of its registration process to let companies self-identify themselves as either LGBT or peoples with disabilities. And it's important that we start gathering data, as Ms. Holt says. If there's not enough companies out there, then you cannot apply goals to a particular area, because that's when the legal issues will come up. But if you have enough registered companies in a particular area, then you could potentially apply goals to that definition, or to the procurement process that you're trying to reach. So for us, this was a win, right? We were the first governmental entity to ever fully pass a policy to start counting LGBT and peoples with disabilities as part of their procurement process in terms of diversity and participation goals for programs. Next slide. So what have we done, and what do the policies do? The policies continue to improve the experience of vendors that do businesses with the district. In terms of the action plan, it's all about gathering data, because without this data, we cannot potentially apply full goals when another disparity session happens in the future. So we will go to the people or to the events that host or that support companies in a particular area to walk them through the process of getting registered with the district, but also helping them into the future if a potential policy actually emerges to quantify that particular area. And we engage with new vendors to participate in the bidding process. We would have targeted goals of 20% increase. It depends on the community. And we do advocacy specifically through the LGBT Chamber of Commerce. We participate in Pride events and Latinx event months, African American Heritage Months also, and we work with supplier diversity. The picture behind is at last year by the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, which we were recognized for what we're doing. Next slide. Go back one slide. Just in terms of MENA, I think we are at a point where working with Commissioner Ada Corral Sepulveda, who's very supportive of this policy, we could potentially do a policy similar to the ones that were created for both LGBT and people with disability. The policy, while some people may think that it doesn't have enough teeth or force behind it, it's a stepping stone and it's a start, like what we always like to do in terms of we need to gather the data. We need to make sure and instruct our communities that this could potentially in the future be an action plan for the future. We need to start getting those smaller companies that do construction work or supply services or do just professional services, make sure that they have their ducks in a row, and possibly get them registered through other areas. There may need to be some sort of global entity to help MENA companies. I don't know. I don't think that there's a national governing board that could potentially be the nexus to create the policy, like a big Arab American chamber or MENA Chamber of Commerce. Fortunately, the LGBT National Chamber of Commerce has a way to certify people. And, you know, many detractors always say anyone could potentially claim that they're part of a community to bypass rules. But the LGBT Global Chamber of Commerce has put certain data available to ensure that only people who are part of the community are able to reap the goods of that policy. So something like that could potentially also happen with MENA. I think with the help of our board, in general, we could potentially pass a policy in the near future to at least start the process to gather data, so that in the future, once there's enough data for another study session in the future, we could potentially apply and create full-blown ordinances to ensure that these three communities and any other communities that are partially marginalized in terms of business practices itself could have programs officially created for them.
Okay. You know, I do want to thank you. I didn't, I'm happy to hear that hopefully an economic study will be conducted like with the city. And I know you and Commissioner Sepulveda are working very hard along with the others. We're very encouraged about what's going on with the Water Reclamation District. I want to introduce now Ashley Alvarez. Ashley is the architect of the City Council resolution that commissioned the economic study for the city of Chicago. She had help from Professor Cainkar and Attorney Holt and myself. We all contributed to that, but we are very happy to have her here with us today. Without further ado, Attorney Ashley Alvarez. Thank you. Unmute. Oh, there you go.
Yep. Thank you, Judge Haddad. And I'm going to share my screen right now. And Commissioner Garcia actually opened up everything perfectly to explain a little bit about the city. Okay. Okay, everyone can see that? Can see the screen? Okay. All right, so we had introduced something in collaboration, and it was really a great partnership, but I'm going to give a little bit of a background on what that looked like and the status of where we're at, and just really emphasizing off of what Commissioner Garcia said, the need for data in these circumstances to really get things moving is the call to action at the end of the day on our side. And that will get us moving to what will hopefully be one of the city's inclusive contracting DB partners. So a little bit on the legislative background, because that's where I can speak the most to. Common types of legislation, we have resolution, ordinances, and orders. A resolution is really formal writing calling attention to something. So it could be something such as someone or honoring someone or something, but also requesting, in our circumstance, hearing be conducted. And typically with this process, this will involve research and preparing legislation, introducing the legislation at City Council. From there, it will be sent to a committee, and I'll give a little bit more of a breakdown on what specifically happened with this resolution. From there, the committee will hear the legislation and vote on the item. If the legislation passes, it goes back to City Council. And upon passage at City Council, the call to action will commence. So all goes well, that's the typical path, but it will give light to the next slide that kind of shows breakdown. This is Legistar, and this is specifically MENA. It shows when it was originally introduced, and then there is a little bit of a gap, about 6 months until the final action where it passed. we have the substitute resolution that was ultimately called and kind of worked on. And so throughout this process, not only was it introduced and worked in collaboration with a lot of partners, we also went back and ended up, having some discussions with the city and some, the law department, some folks on that side. And upon that moment, we decided to get a little bit more specific with what our call to action would be and make it more aligned with what the city typically does in these instances prior to determining that there will be a DBE partnership. There are about 6 there. It's not as common as we would like. We definitely know that there is a lot of diversity partners that should be included within contracting and reaping those rewards, but there is still a long way to go. So with that being said, after we did our original introduction in September, it went to the Committee on Contracting and Oversight and Equity. This is where all of the diversity, contracting, minority-based business enterprise contracting will go. That's the jurisdiction of that committee. That committee will then decide, they voted unanimously, as Judge Haddad mentioned, and then it went to City Council. So now we're left with really the last step. Sorry, I'll go back a little bit. So with the substitute resolution, and the reason why we changed it, our ask had been originally a little bit broad. We did highlight, the U.S. Census and some really important, like the American Community Survey studies that would support why there is a need for MENA Americans to be included within the minority group. However, our ask still was just include them without doing the procedure that would typically be the study and collecting that data. So with the substitute resolution, it was just kind of shortened a little bit, tightened up, and concentrated ask for the study to be regarding MENA Americans as a minority group among the city's code of racial or ethnic eligible to compete for city construction opportunities. And that is currently where we are. So the next steps is really just working in partnership. It's great to hear everything that's going on at the water rec, because this is something that when we're moving and we're looking to other identifiable local partners, having that and really working in collaboration will be so important. It really just helps us move in synchronicity. Sometimes we need some other examples of what other people are doing so that we can get the stuff done on our side. And so I'm really excited to see the progress and really the movement that has been going on over there, because hopefully that will mean that it can open some doors for us. If not, we do still need to keep advocating at the city level and making sure that we are working in collaboration with all of the partners that got us here from the beginning. We know how important this is, especially as we're listening to things like Colette had mentioned earlier with cases that are being considered by the Supreme Court. There's a purpose and a reason why we have the certification. The certification is essential. It is needed to make sure that there's good business collaborations, diversity in these spaces. And it starts with school, but it ends with all of the opportunities that we can see throughout the city, state, and really the nation. So diversity has been able to bring us a lot, as a Latina, a lot of great opportunities. And I know how valuable that is to all the other communities that deserve that as well. So something personally, personal, I guess, to me, that I want to see through, and I will continue pushing that the study is conducted. At the moment, we do not have a known date for when it will commence, but we are working to get that confirmed as soon as possible. Oh, Judge Haddad, you might be muted.
What we're working on right now with the City Council is to put it on the budget through the procurement department. I love learning about city government. This is crazy, but we're doing it. And luckily with Commissioner Garcia, we are talking to the financial chairman at Water Reclamation. So it'll be a race to see which of you two starts the study. But I'll tell you right now, it'll be the first time in U.S. history a study's been done of our community to qualify us this way. It's a beginning. And what Colette Holt said, that augmenting any application, individual application with this study will cut, I think, 90% of the work for an individual businessman to get certified. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Marcelino.
Oh, no, Judge Haddad. This morning I learned from my staff was talking with Commissioner Corral Sepulveda's staff, and I know that she wants an appropriation put in next year's budget to start a process to
Great news.
conduct this study. So if it happens, then hopefully we'll be number one.
Okay.
Challenge to the city.
Okay, now I'm going to move over to my good friend, Professor Louise Cainkar at Marquette University. Let me tell you, she is the foremost expert in Arab American, MENA American demographics. And her articles and books are peer reviewed, are first class and tops in the country. So without further ado, Professor Cainkar, you're on.
I should have grabbed, I have a book that just came out last week. I'd like to show you, but I don't have it within my
Just like CNN, hold it up in front of the camera, right?
Yeah, but I'd have to move. So maybe when I'm finished, it's called Sedjalu, Arab American, a reader in SWANA studies. And
Put it on the chat room. Please do it. Put that on the chat room. Okay.
Anyhow, I don't have a lot of time. Tony, can you put up my slides? Thank you. I was going to walk you through the history. I'm going to have to summarize that of counting MENA Americans, but I just want to say that I have been doing that for decades. When people say there are no data on MENA Americans or Arab Americans, it's not true. It's just that we have had to collect our data using a different method. We cannot use the race categories because MENA Americans are subsumed under white. So what we've been doing for decades is using census long form data on the ancestry question and gathering data on MENA Americans. So what is your ethnic ancestry, right? That's the question. Anybody who answered any Arab nationality or Arab or any ethnic group within MENA, Assyrian, Kurdish, Amazigh, whatever, we would gather those codes together. And back in the early days, pre-online, we had to send the codes we wanted looked at, the ethnic nationality codes, the social codes, such as education, housing, income, etc., the geographic areas we wanted looked at, and we'd send that list to a Census Bureau regional center, which when I started was at Northern Illinois University, and ask them to run the data for us. And then we'd get in the mail, a big set of papers. And if we wanted to cross tab like gender by education or income by occupation, we had to do that manually. Anyhow, those days are over, alhamdulillah, but we've been doing it for a long time. And another important thing is that the scholars that were working on MENA Americans, we all agreed on the definition of MENA Americans. And this is important because if everybody's using a different definition, you can't communicate. Right? You can't compare across regions. You can't compare over time. So we had agreement, and I'm going to show you when we move to later slides what that is. You can move to the next slide. This is kind of a summary of what I'm running through very quickly here. For example, in the 90s, because I like to compare across MENA groups, I wanted to know who were these Arab Americans who were answering Arab and not giving a nationality. And I was able to get census public data and find out that the people who were answering Arab lived between 55th and 87th Street and Western and Pulaski. In other words, they were Palestinians. And I wrote a whole article on that, but that's not our topic today. In the 2005, the Census Bureau started the American Community Survey. It moved the ancestry question to that. Now we have data on an annual basis, but it's a small sample of the population. So we have to put 5 years of data together to have anything accurate. So, one of my points is that we do have data and we can collect data on MENA Americans. We just have to do it a little bit differently than the way others who have it easy using race categories can do it, or the Hispanic category, which is an ethnic category. But one thing I want to talk about, I hope I have time here. I was recently asked to write a chapter by a scholar at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, to write a chapter on racial attacks against Arab and Muslim Americans. And unfortunately, for a major book on racist violence in the United States, and unfortunately, I had to tell him that it was impossible to write such a piece, because the data on hate crimes, on assaults, on attacks against MENA Americans are sloppy, episodic and inconsistent. And I looked around the country for another scholar who could do this, and I couldn't find one. So, you know, you can talk about an attack that occurred here or there or this year and that year, but we have no systematic data. The reason we don't is because of the lack of a MENA code at the local, county, state, and national levels. So, for example, when I looked at this in Cook County, police were recording hate crimes against Arab or Muslim Americans as either white, Asian, or other. So we have no data, right? And that's the data that goes to the FBI. So you'll find some data, but it's going to be a small proportion of what's real. So this points out the problem of having no MENA category within administrative service, enforcement, and other government agencies. MENA Americans become erased. It's as if they don't exist. We know MENA Americans face high levels of racial violence, but they will not be in this book. They will not be in this book because we don't have the data. And then people will say there isn't a problem, but there is a problem, right? So scholars have demonstrated in numerous ways that the MENA American experience is not the white American experience. I have done so among other scholars for a very long time, and it's good to hear people are listening. The fact is that MENA identified persons are hyper visible when it comes to surveillance, hate crimes, stereotypes, but invisible when it comes to conversations about discrimination. Much has changed in American society since 1977, when the official US race and ethnic categories were defined, and MENA Americans were lumped in with whites at the time, and social conditions have seriously deteriorated for MENA Americans. I'm going to move to the data. I just have one more little vignette here. I want to offer one measure of discrimination before I move to some economic indicators found in census data. Existing data show that MENA Americans are highly concentrated in small business, especially in what we call middleman minority retail business. That is the middleman between the marginal middleman, so this middle person between white producers and wholesalers and people of color consumers. And various groups in the history of the United States have been in that middleman minority position. That's why we have a whole theory on it. For example, Italians and Jews. But within one generation, they moved out of that middleman minority position and began to climb the social hierarchy. MENA Americans have been in this economic niche for 100 years. And while that's something to be proud of, it also shows that there's persistent and worsening discrimination in mainstream occupational niches. And as I will show you now, MENA Americans systematically make much less than equally educated white Americans. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so sorry it's so small, but so some scholars, colleagues of mine, have what they've done is they've gone to the race white data and they've pulled out MENA Americans from white. And when they looked at MENA Americans compared to white Americans in the Chicago metro area, this is what they found. MENA Americans are 23% more likely to live in poverty. That's pretty shocking. They have a 34% poverty rate compared to 11% non-Hispanic whites. They support a much higher rate of multi-generation households. They're 30% less likely than white non-Hispanic whites to have health insurance. They're 11.5% more likely to have no health insurance and 10% less likely to own a home. And these figures hold even though MENA Americans and white Americans have roughly equal employment rates and equal rates of college education. Okay, we're not comparing apples and oranges here. We're comparing people that have the same median levels of education. We have these discrepancies. Move to the next slide is just the data. We don't have time to, I just want to show you there are data. Okay, next slide is national level comparison, taking the same comparison, pulling MENA Americans out of the white racial category. At the national level, MENA Americans, Arab Americans, we're using these interchangeably right now, but technically that's not correct. Arab Americans are younger, more likely to be unemployed, to live in poverty, and to lack private health insurance nationwide, despite having higher rates of college education. So you can see here the national level data. MENA persons are more likely to live in poverty, to lack private health insurance, or to have health insurance at all, or to own a home. So you can skip to the next slide. I'm running through this quickly. I just want to show you here the third from the bottom. Nationwide, 48% of MENA Americans have a college degree or more, 5% higher than whites, yet much higher rates of poverty, lower rates of insurance, lower rates of home ownership. Next slide, please. We have a study coming out soon from the University of Illinois, Chicago, that at MENA American household income, and it showed that they had the sharpest decline in household income of all racial and ethnic groups in the metropolitan Chicago area, and their incomes declined even at higher levels than Blacks and Native Americans, and that the median household income of MENA Americans in Metro Chicago is $21,000 below that of the overall Chicago population. Again, high rates of education, low rates of income. That's discrimination. Next slide, please. We have other studies that show Arab Americans have higher rates of diabetes and hypertension than whites, lower life expectancies than whites, higher rates of depression when compared to Blacks and whites, increasing discrimination and hate crime victimization. Arab Americans on college campuses are unserved because they are not recognized as existing. They lack mental health services. They lack access to resources. Next slide, please. Maybe we could talk about this, but anyhow, I should just say that the Office of Management and Budget and the Census Bureau well, the Census Bureau was ready, and I was part of that group to launch a MENA category for the 2020 census, but the Trump administration stopped it. But this is what the category would look like. It includes the nationality groups in the first layer there, the ethnicities in the second layer, but some of us would like to see the nationalities in the bottom row also added. The Census Bureau does not want to, for some reason, add Black Africans to the MENA category, which is something we want them to be added. Next slide. Okay, MENA now, MENA here. Racial and ethnic categories based on conditions in existence 50 years ago are flawed and inadequate, yet they remain all across the country due to bureaucratic resistance to change. The main argument we hear is there is no data. There is data. I just showed you data. MENA Americans have become a socially disadvantaged group, and since the Chicago metropolitan area is home to the 4th largest concentration of MENA populations in the United States, the largest Palestinian and Assyrian, 2nd largest Jordanian, this is the place to get it done. I think that's the end.
Well, I would just add one thing. Thank you, by the way, that was excellent. And for the definition, what Commissioner Garcia and Attorney Alvarez and Holt might say is there is a lot of data out there, like you say, and the sources we don't know. But for these types of plans, minority business enterprise plans, to study, the economic study must include the disparity in business, the business community, and their disparity between Arab American businesses and non-Hispanic white. Now, we know the information's out there, but the data sets don't exist, is what I'm told. And we're gonna plow through that. And by having these economic studies by the Water Reclamation and by the city, we might be able to gather that data and create a base for that quantitative data. But in the meantime, these other ideas of an expedited certification process that cuts 90% of the work down might be effective. Well, anyways, I just wanted to thank you. Go ahead, Louise.
First of all, I did use Bureau of Labor Statistics. At one time, I looked very microly at Arab American business practices. So there are some business data out there. I don't know if they're the right kind. But
yeah, that's what we need.
This is why we teach research methodology at the university level, because and Colette Holt had it right. There are multiple ways of getting this data, even if initially they are not systematic quantitative data.
Well, this is so good, and thank you so much. I'm going to close it up now. by thanking our panelists and our organizers today. And to remind everybody that the Arab American Bar Association's installation dinner is on November the 2nd. Congressman Raja will be our keynote speaker, and an award to Justice Reyes. You could tell the minority community is being honored at that particular dinner. I hope all of you come and look on our website, arabbar.org, to go to find that. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. It was an excellent, excellent presentation by all of our presenters. Everybody have a great day. Bless you all. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.